everybody. Welcome to panel number one of the 12:30 hour. I'm Margaret Summers, moderating this panel. And this is Reading Polanyi, Fascism, Culture, Guild, Socialism, and the State, which covers just about everything. We have four speakers today. Each one is going to speak for 15 minutes. And while they're speaking, I encourage anyone who's interested to click on the Q&A icon and type in your questions. And because I am the only one and the technicians who can read it, in other words, the audience can't read the Q&A, I will, at the end of the four sessions, four presentations, I will read out as many questions as I can. So each person is going to speak for 15 minutes, as I said. Our first speaker is Kristopher Millett, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Concordia University. He is also the producer and director of the video that Margie referred to earlier that is available on the website of the conference, available to be viewed anytime between 8 in the morning and 10 at night. It's a video on Polanyi's influence in scholarship, apparently a very large empirical project. He is going to be speaking on the meaning and contemporary significance of fascism in the writings of Karl Polanyi. Our second speaker is Aman Banerji, who is a PhD student in sociology at Cornell University in the US, and he's going to be speaking on culture and commodification, the new economic sociology, hostile worlds, and the specter of Polanyi. Our third speaker is Sanghan Lim, who is from the Graduate School of Public Policy and Civic Engagement at Kyung University in Korea. He's going to be speaking on Karl Polanyi's Guild Socialism and the local social economy. And finally, we have Paula Valderrama, who is a newly minted PhD, no longer a PhD candidate, but a doctor now from the Freie University in Germany. Paula is going to be speaking on state power in Polanyi's work, Emancipation or Serfdom. So first, let's turn to Kristopher, and you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Summers, for that great introduction. As mentioned, my paper attempts to piece together a theory of fascism, looking at different writings from Karl Polanyi on the subject, and then try to determine its contribution to the study of fascism and towards understanding present circumstances. As many of you know, there's no shortage of pieces coming up today on what is fascism. However, many accounts that I'm seeing, they rarely have anything new or illuminating to say on the subject. They tend to remain within the confines of viewing fascism as either an extreme form of nationalism or racism. And it's largely left unclear as to why fascism seems to be manifesting itself everywhere and what this means. Almost entirely absent from this discussion is Karl Polanyi, despite him having lived through the period of classical fascism and written on it extensively. It's true that scholars of Polanyi are increasingly turning to his work on fascism, which I will discuss further in a little bit. It's important to note, though, that the current Polanian treatments of fascism that have come out recently are largely within the confines of economic sociology, et cetera. And so they're pretty much siloed from the field of fascism studies proper. In that discipline, or like neo-fascism studies as popularized by people like Roger Griffin, you'll sometimes see mention of like the Frankfurt critical theorists, or even Peter Drucker's End of Economic Man, which clearly owed a debt to Polanyi, but never Polanyi himself. So returning to the task of my paper, which appeared in Theory and Society back in January, is how do we piece together a Polanyian theory of fascism, and what does it have to say about today? So I'll start by just quickly going over Polanyi's treatment of fascism in the Great Transformation. This is where he most famously wrote about fascism, and it's where most accounts go to. Here, the emergence of fascism is located within the utopian endeavor to set up an economic system based on the principle of self-regulating markets. Fascism achieves success as the market system and its institutional supports dissolve on an international scale following the 1929 Wall Street crash. Of course, for Polanyi, the market system itself was a radical innovation, which the book aims to denaturalize as a historically inevitable or optimal way of organizing human affairs. As Polanyi put it, instead of the economy being embedded in social relations, through this idea of the market system, social relations become embedded in the economic system. As mentioned, fascism would arrive on a grand scale during the Great Depression as efforts were made internationally to maintain the market-based system in the face of increasing institutional paralysis. You had a real antagonism develop between laissez-faire economics and popular government, and this idea that politics and economic spheres ought to be separated under economic liberalism. Economic power is in private hands and sits outside the control of democracy, and pressures for austerity under the international monetary system in the 30s obstructed democratic governments from making reforms to protect workers or industries. Polanyi talks about how capitalists and ruling elites at some point turned to fascists as he put it, an easy way out at whatever price. Fascism presented a solution to the crisis of market society, allowing nations a way to shield their citizenries and industries alike from its perils and reintegrate its political and economic spheres. Industrial production and private ownership would be safeguarded, while democratic institutions were abolished. In essence, capitalism was preserved, but at the expense of democracy and market liberalism itself. It's been noted from this treatment of fascism in the Great Transformation that, for all its horrors, fascism is kind of presented as being no more radical than the market system itself, which Polanyi described the market system as a peculiar and entirely unnatural organization of economic life. So moving to today, many current analysts see similar dynamics at play, setting the stage for fascism's possible return. Ominous parallels are drawn between the coexistence of market-driven social and economic insecurities, liberal democracies beholden to austerity policies, and palpable nationalist, authoritarian, and populist discontent. And as mentioned, this is where most Polanyian treatments of fascism start and stop, looking at fascism's political and economic utility as seen in the Great Transformation, and trying to understand what that means for today. The problem with this, I'd say, is that Polanyi doesn't talk much about the content of fascism itself in the Great Transformation, outside of the conditions that contributed to its rise. So what you get out of this in terms of current stuff that's been written on Polanyi and fascism is what I would describe as rather lean Polanyi definitions of fascism, such as fascism being, for Polanyi, regulated capitalism without democratic institutions, or fascism as a type of protective influenza in capitalism that goes from small to big based on the health of the market economy and its democratic structures. What I say in my paper is that this presents an incomplete picture of Polanyi's understanding of fascism, and it potentially cuts short the power of his analysis for today. So in my paper, I try to go beyond the Great Transformation to a lot of his other writings, particularly his under-examined essay, The Essence of Fascism, to try to show how Polanyi's work on fascism points to deeper sociological questions than the functioning of the market economy. So one of the main things I try to do is do a thorough exegesis of the essence of fascism, using archival texts that came around the same time, and also looking at the social personalist philosophy of John McMurray. They seem to be influencing each other in the 1930s to try to understand what Polanyi's talking about. It would be impossible to try to explain the entire essay in the time left. It's a very dense and at times confounding essay. And I find people tend to just cite passages from it that largely conform to what Polanyi's talking about, the Great Transformation. But I'll try to cover a couple of the main points and we'll see where we get. So the most important thing that Polanyi does in the essence of fascism is he breaks from the consensus interpretation by claiming that at its core, fascist ideology is rooted in an extreme form of anti-individualism. It denies both the integrity and value of the individual and their equality in society. In the essence of fascism, Polanyi states that fascist philosophy is an effort to produce a vision of the world in which society is not a relationship of persons. A society, in fact, where there are either no conscious human beings or their consciousness has no reference to the existence and functioning of society. Polanyi saw a link between liberalism, democracy, and socialism, and that all promote the sanctity of the individual. Polanyi traces this back to the Christian doctrine of the brotherhood of man, that because every person has a soul, they are uniquely valued as an individual and stand in equality with others. Fascism opposes liberalism, democracy, and particularly socialism, which for Polanyi represents the farthest realization of the individual, enshrining the individual in economic rights. So then Polanyi turns to discussing what fascist thought replaces individualism with. And here's where things get complicated. Polanyi argues that there's two types of philosophies that forms of fascism embody in different quantities. The first one he calls vitalism, a philosophy based on an extreme interpretation of Nietzsche, which Polanyi locates in overlooked German philosopher Ludwig Klages. Vitalism privileges the non-conscious functions of human life, supposedly located in the body, and it negates any sense of ethics, ego, or other vitality-sapping properties of the mind. Vitalists instead strive for an organic sense of harmony, untroubled by moral conscience, as Polanyi puts it, where life is immediate like touch. The other theory Polanyi describes, which is its polar opposite, is what he describes as totalitarianism. And with this essay, The Essence of Fascism, appearing in 1935, totalitarianism was a rarely used word at this point and almost had barely appeared in the English language. Polanyi talks about totalitarianism as representing Othmar Spann's vulgarization of Hegel's philosophy. Here, again, it's anti-individualist. Individual subjectivity is subsumed entirely in larger entities like the state, religion, or capital. These entities are seen as the basic units of society, and persons are not related to one another except through them. This creates a sense of permanent self-estrangement, where Polanyi describes it as nothing personal has substance unless it be objectified, has become impersonal, and everything seems to possess life except human beings. Polanyi notes the seed for this in capitalist production, where human relationships are less direct and immediate, and commodities themselves begin to possess a strange selfhood of their own. So, as mentioned, Polanyi suggests that vitalism and totalitarianism are kind of like the ideological poles of fascist thought. Both theories unite in abolishing the individual subject. In vitalism, a mythological past is privileged where the person has not yet been born into society, whereas in totalitarianism, the post-conscious person has already been absorbed in society. In one, history has not yet started, and in the other, it has ended. In The Essence of Fascism, Polanyi also describes in more detail the systemic form this takes, which he calls corporative capitalism. And again, fascism's anti-individualist and totalitarian roots become apparent. It's an order where the dependence of the whole in no way relies on the participation or will or purpose of the individuals in it. Democratic parties and institutions are dissolved, and major branches of industry are recognized as corporations and endowed with political responsibilities. I see I'm getting low on time, so I'm going to try to skate ahead here. What the rest of my paper tries to do is look at how do we interpret this and how do we put it together with Polanyi's account of fascism's political and economic function in the Great Transformation. And I looked at an archival text that Polanyi never finished in the 1930s called Fascism and Socialism. And in it, Polanyi firstly notes that fascist movements are devoted to rectifying the functional crisis between the political and economic institutions. But then he also explains that there is a moral crisis which runs parallel to the political and economic. I'm quoting him here. The meeting of individual life and the freedom of personality has become a problem. We cannot link up the effects of our life and actions. So I look more at Polanyi's ideas of the individual, and this is where I look at John McMurray to try to kind of help draw it out more. And in short, because I think I only have a minute left, basically Polanyi felt that for people, human life has meaning when we can morally account for our own actions and when we are able to satisfy our impulse to community. In modern society, both of these factors are compromised, and therefore you can see where the anti-individualist philosophy of fascism becomes more relevant, as well as theories like vitalism and totalitarianism that try to kind of relieve us of the business of trying to adhere to the concept of an individual. So we now see in Polanyi's conception that fascism emerges in response to two critical problems in a liberal capitalist society. The first being the instability of the market system and the broader incompatibility between capitalist production and democracy. And the second, a crisis of the individual in modern capitalism. So I think that our current discussions can be joined by both of these things. Polanyi does a lot more also in terms of his interventions into current fascism studies, because he displaces the idea of fascism as being an extreme form of racism or nationalism. These are more surface appearances that don't get at fascism's core function or its core contents. There's a lot more I'd like to say, but I probably should stop there because I think I'm over time. So thanks a lot for having me, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Kristopher. And luckily, we can all go and look at your Theory in Society article. You said it was from January of this year, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We now turn to Aman Banerji.
Thanks to the committee of organizers at the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy and to Dr. Summers for the introduction. I'm Aman. I'm a PhD student in development sociology at Cornell. So the paper that I'm looking to present today focuses on the, sorry, I'm just setting up my screen here, focuses on the interrelation between Polanyian ideas of commodification and a particular vein of literature within the economic sociology tradition that I refer to here as cultural economic sociology. While I present here a critique of this literature drawing on Polanyi, I want to be clear just how powerful and provocative I found much of this literature. To start with, I want to look to outline the nature of this literature within economic sociology, that, as I mentioned, I refer to as cultural economic sociology, as well as the conditions within which it took shape, and three critical contributions that it makes to our treatment of economy. Following this, in the second section of my presentation, I will focus on the core problematic that much of this literature addresses itself to, and the important critique of classical sociological analyses that it makes. In the third part of my comments, I argue for three central limitations to this literature, drawing on Polanyi's ideas. Overall, though, I want to suggest that this intellectual engagement between cultural economic sociology and Polanyi's ideas has a lot to contribute, in my view, to our understanding of the interlinkage between the cultural and economic domains within capitalist society. So to start, Viviana Zelitzer's programmatic essay of 1988, entitled Beyond the Polemics of the Market, was a seminal intervention, inaugurating an emerging new subfield within economic sociology. This body of economic sociology focused on examining the role of culture, symbols, and meaning-making in any analysis of the economic. Zelitzer's intervention itself came in the midst of a critical and dynamic period for the field of economic sociology, including Mark Granovetter's ideas of embeddedness of 1985. Where previous traditions of economic sociology had often looked to either extend existing economic models to new phenomena or to offer features of social organization as contextual factors, instead, this literature sought to view both economy differently and to detect culture in the, quote, very social relations we call economic, then integrate culture into explanations of economic phenomena, end quote. Thus, culture emerge here as a contingent and a constitutive element for all economic processes. By examining the cultural and the moral processes of market making, the literature moved away from an abstracted economic domain and toward the rich grounding of everyday economies. This is the first critical contribution I want to argue that this literature makes. I want to suggest two others. Second, I want to argue that these theorists necessarily required a methodology to pair with this approach of the idea of economy as a terrain of everyday action rooted in meaning-making. Cultural economic sociology thus deployed a host of qualitative and ethnographic methodologies toward this purpose. Equally, rethinking the economic domain as one characterized by social relationships, cultural norms, moralizing practices, and daily meaning-making also necessitated a new version of evidence, one that included court cases, interviews, observations, newspaper clippings, and more. This approach, I want to suggest, facilitated a look at the how and the why of daily economic practices. Cultural economic sociology's third key contribution I want to suggest was its choice of markets and commodities to be examined. Here, the literature centered, quote, contested commodities, namely those that became legitimate following the institutionalization of legitimizing narratives. Grounding their analysis in these unusual places entailed the possibility of transcending economic boundaries and, more importantly, showing just how crucial cultural and moral framings were to market making. Following Zelitzer's programmatic note of 1988, the range of contested commodities examined in this literature includes organ donation, Kieran Healy, fashion models, Ashley Mears, artwork, Weltwist, child labor and domestic economies by Zelitzer herself, life insurance by Chiris Chan, hospice care by Roy Leavner, and more. The broader intellectual project of cultural economy, I want to suggest, seeks to, quote, explain the complex historical, cultural, and socio-structural variability of economic life, in Zelitzer's words. This multiple markets approach was written rather explicitly as a critique of what is often termed hostile worlds, a view that was advocated to a host of classical sociological theorists, including Marx, Weber, Simmel, Durkheim, among others. It is very useful here, I want to argue, to outline the notion of hostile worlds that has continued to unite by opposition the field of cultural economic sociology, and this is where I want to turn for the second part of my presentation. So the hostile worlds view within the cultural economic sociology literature is viewed as comprising three key assumptions that cultural economic sociologists challenge. First is the notion of the market as an ever-expanding force that destroys or degrades social, moral, or personal values. Second, hostile world theorists are seen as imagining a clear dichotomization between an amoral cash nexus and, quote, sacred, social, and personal non-instrumental values, in Zelitzer's words. Third, through this ontology, hostile worlds advocates are said to advocate for the separation of this sacred zone of non-economic values from the market through either institutional constraints or normative constraints that preserve certain areas outside of the cash nexus. Thus, critically, hostile worlds literature is presented here not only as arguing for an ontological separation between real and cultural or intimate economies, but equally making a normative assumption about the need to uphold a boundary between these two to prevent the contamination of one by the other. For the cultural economic sociology literature, then, the conception of markets as universally homogenizing forces of rationalization and instrumentalism thus misses the variability of practices that produce and are produced by the market. At its heart, I want to argue that cultural economic sociologists' critique of hostile worlds doctrine then is fundamentally a question of economic determinism. Cultural economic sociologists express frustration at the manner in which cultural, social, and moral processes appear fully determined by the sphere of the economy within hostile worlds. The cultural sphere then, far from retaining any independence, let alone having the power to influence other domains, appears fully accounted for. As Stuart Hall has argued in a related and powerful critique of traditional Marxism, although presented as a relational whole, socio-structural transformation within this analysis is, quote, thought in terms of a broad determination. Changes in the economic structure of society will, more or less rapidly, produce consequent and determinate changes in the legal and political structures and in the ideological forms, end quote. So rather than leaving room for both the relative autonomy of the cultural and moral spheres and its active determining potential on economic processes of commodification, hostile worlds, it is argued, presuppose the construction of a degraded morality via an insatiable and fixed market. Through this critique, I want to arrive at two critical questions. First, how can we examine today the linkage between the economic and the cultural without producing an economically determinist analysis? This, I would argue, is the real value of a cultural economic sociology approach. Second, and equally important, is how do contemporary methodologies recognize the interplay of cultural and economic within the specificity of a commodification-centric capitalist society? Drawing on Polanyi, it is this second arena that I want to suggest can be under-examined within some of the cultural economic sociology literature. To turn to the third and the final part of my presentation then, I want to make three key critiques building on Polanyi. First, I want to suggest that amid a critique of hostile worlds, cultural economic sociology can often sidestep the particular form of capitalist culture that animated classical sociologists, including Polanyi. Second, I want to suggest that the literature sidelines the formal economy in pursuit of the substantive. And third, that it provides a limited view of the macro social worlds of commodification. I'll now turn to each of these critiques. First, Polanyi criticized classical economists of his period for the manner in which they, quote, naturalize the type of economy that they observe in their own society and falsely generalize conditions that are approximately true in the 19th century, end quote. For Polanyi, and it's linking back to Kristopher's comments, the disembedding of the social from the economic domain was a critical particularity of capitalist economies in stark contrast to its predecessors. As Marianne Foucault has argued, it is this, quote, institutional order generated through capitalism that is often left out by cultural economic sociologists' focus on interaction within particular economies. Polanyian disembedding, I want to argue, can be critiqued as perpetually incomplete, as cultural economic sociologists show us, while upholding an understanding of disembedding and economic determinism as a project always in formation under capitalist social relations. Thus, there may need be no contradiction between refuting the reality of economic determinism on the one hand, as cultural economic sociologists do, while taking seriously the capitalist project of producing economic determinism that Polanyi draws attention to. Cultural economic sociologists' instinctive critique of hostile worlds appears to let this notion of economic determinism as an active process and a capitalist project always in formation often slide out of view. To turn to my second critique, I want to talk about the distinction Polanyi makes between formal and substantivist economies. In two essays, The Economistic Fallacy and The Economy as Instituted Process, Polanyi argued that the term economy is really a compound of two meanings, substantive and formal. A substantive view of the economy is defined as, quote, an instituted process of interaction between man and his environment, end quote. and it's that in which the satisfaction of wants occurred through the use of material means. This substantive conception of the economy, Polanyi suggests, is transhistorical, since it fits with most historical social formations in which the social and economic spheres were inseparable. In contrast, though, the formal view of the economic is one rooted in a situation of definite choice between different uses of means caused by an insufficiency of means or a condition of scarcity. For Polanyi, market society introduces this formalist conception of the economy wherein man's livelihood or the pursuit of substantive economy is for the first time fundamentally tied to the operation of choices induced by insufficient means in price-making markets. Thus, for Polanyi, and in contrast to neoclassical economists of his age, the formal economy is not a natural reality, but a particular institutional construction. As he states, only under market society was man's substantive economy, quote, put under the control of that newfangled institutional creation of superlative power, the market, which developed overnight from lowly beginnings, end quote. Cultural economic sociology has demonstrated the limits to Polanyi's totalizing argument that within market society, all substantive economy is subsumed under the formal economy. Yet, in so doing, much of this literature often seems to be situated within a seemingly trans-historical economic sphere that pays little attention to the formalist economy under market society. For my third and final critique, I want to preface it by noting that the cultural economic sociology literature's turn to centering micro and meso levels of analysis within a particular market and the grounding of the economy in daily practices has been deeply productive. Yet, by artificially separating microeconomic practices from macro socioeconomic structuring, I want to argue we end up with a limited conception of these micro-social practices. A turn to examine unusual places or special markets within this literature could be seen as a key contributor to this macro-social neglect. Portraying particular markets and commodities as exceptional can end up situating practices within them as seemingly outside of the broader structural dynamics of commodification. Cultural economic sociology's fascination with the variable, open, and contingent nature of markets as social phenomena appears then at times to move away from the long history and the nature of commodification. Yet drawing on Polanyi's ideas, particularly around fictitious commodities, capitalist commodification is necessarily a relational process, wherein the commodification of a particular domain ignites new possibilities for others within market society. This relationality of capitalist commodification is difficult to situate within cultural economic sociology's deeply grounded economic analysis. Yet, I want to argue doing so is critical to examining the forms of inequality and exploitation produced by the consistent commodification of new arenas. To conclude, I want to argue for the value of cultural economic sociology's critique of an a priori overly deterministic conception of markets within the hostile worlds, as they call it, tradition. Simultaneously, though, I want to reaffirm Polanyi's concern with the particular nature of culture amid capitalism, the separation between the formal and the substantive, and the long history of commodification-centric violence. Melding these two traditions through our analysis and in our methodologies is admittedly a difficult task, and yet I want to suggest in closing one that is worth striving for. To close, I just want to note this is a paper in the works and one that I would be deeply interested in subjecting to your feedback. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Aman. That was incredibly stimulating. I appreciate it. Our next speaker is Sanghan Lim from the Kyung University in Korea. Are you here, Sang?
Yes.
All yours.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. And I think it's not. Sorry. I guess I started. Can you see me?
Yes.
All right. Brilliant. I think it's kind of trend to put this family name in front in East Asia, so I just changed it a little bit. But anyway, thank you very much for the introduction. So I can see there are very kind of various topics in this session, and I wish I don't bring another complexity in your brain. So let me see. Yes. So my presentation is about Polanyi's guild socialism, which is not very much frequently discussed, I guess. And it is very much based on my experience in Korea and Japan about their responses, social economy organizations' responses on COVID-19 crisis. And I got interested in the relationship between the social economy organization and the local community, which are, in a sense, separated, but to many, they are quite closely interlinked. So how they should be or they are interconnected, that is kind of my research question. And as I wrote here, I attended some forums, internet forums about these difficulties, which actually more uttering the difficulties that SEOs or local citizens are experiencing, and some of them are more focusing on local residents' livelihood problems, whereas others are more about the the problems of leading businesses of the social economy organizations. And to be honest, the former one is more about the Japanese case, and the latter one was more about Korea. And after discussing about those issues, then what followed was criticizing each other or self-criticizing that the social economy should be more locally based, or the social economy should be more independent or voluntary. But my question was, should it be an either or question? And can we say which system is better? So I'd like to explore the relationship between the local community and the social economy, hinted by Karl Polanyi's idea of guild socialism and functional organization of society. Karl Polanyi was interested in guild socialism, especially in the 1920s. I don't know whether he kept his interest in this topic after the 1920s, but at least he mentioned about active community, even in the 1940s, tame empire, I guess. So Polanyi criticized, of course, self-regulating market and fictitious commodification, which the previous presenters already mentioned about. And so as an alternative, he proposed workers' association, or the guild, which would free workers from capitalistic ownership of the means of production. But one of the differences that he had with other guild socialism advocates, well, maybe he is not the only person who said that, but workers were not the only group who should be emancipated from the market economy. Consumers, another pillar of economy, and the residents of local communities also should be emancipated from this from market society. And also he pointed out the differences between workers' association and local commune in his term. So the former is a voluntary association, whereas the latter involuntary organization. So in a sense, the former is more like Gesellschaft and the latter Gemeinschaft. His idea of reconciling these two or three different groups is kind of by recognition, networks of recognition rather than institution. So what Polanyi emphasized was, as the first presenter said, these networks among free and soulful individual persons. So in a sense, kind of Christian socialism, I guess. So he criticized one-dimensional human view of the market society. He said producers are basically not a separate group of persons from consumers. All human beings are consumers at the same time, producers or workers, and at the same time residents or citizens. So therefore, this negotiation in a functionally organized society among different groups is nothing more than a cooperation and deliberation among persons with cross-cutting identities. So Polanyi distinguished the networks of recognition in the functionally organized society from power relations among separate interest groups in a statist or market society. And also, Polanyi didn't deny the state. I think the state will be more deeply dealt with by the final presenter. But at least according to my reading, yes, Polanyi was not entirely against the state itself. So he is not an ardent supporter of syndicalism either. So he said instead of remaining in a boundary of locality, he attempted to extend it to the national level. What is that? In the national level, workers can be presented by Congress, National Congress of Workers, whereas local communes are represented by the state. So the institution that links local and national levels was representative democracy. So yes, as I have mentioned, Polanyi's idea was functionally organized society. So it is functional division, functional categorization of, let's say, categorization of different functions rather than division of different interest groups. Sorry, please understand me, but it is now 2:13 a.m. in Korea, so I am not in very good condition to present a paper, but I'll do my best. So that is so far Polanyi's idea of guild socialism and the functional organization of society, which includes the guild, the representation of the guild as well. So now I have been talking about Karl Polanyi's idea. Oh, thank you very much. So what are the possible implications of Polanyi's idea on the current current understanding of the social economy? Well, I think studies and practices of researchers and practitioners of the social economy having some kind of institutionalist perspectives on the social economy. So, for instance, MS are carrying out an excellent project about categorizing social economy organizations according to their institutional forms. And also the cooperation of the social economy with locality often means SEO's participation in social programs, local programs promoted by local authorities, like giving jobs to local residents or something like that, and providing social services for the local residents. And also the interconnectedness between the social economy and the local community is often promoted in an institutionalistic way, like binding institutions. Sometimes obliging social economy organizations to employ certain proportion, employ local residents, or obliging them to participate in local projects set by the local authorities. And also sometimes SCOs construct a multi-stakeholder cooperative where in which different kinds of social groups are existing together. But so this kind of institutional combination or institutional unity. But Polanyi's guild socialism suggests more kind of more different alternative perspective, emphasizing recognition and cross-cutting membership rather than institutional unification. So I think one of the lessons Polanyi not lessons, but kind of implications. Well, we don't have to learn everything from Polanyi, yes. So one of the implications is the kind of the coexistence between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft in the 21st century. So SEUs are social economy organizations are basically free and voluntary associations, whereas local communities are not necessarily voluntary. The reason why I'm saying necessarily is because of the third point here. But anyway, the second one, and also there is welfare state. So the public authority has a primary duty for the welfare of citizens. So SCOs shouldn't be an easy excuse for local or central authorities why they should be relieved from their welfare burden, so-called. And the thing is, nowadays, urbanization has been very much progressed. And sometimes in developmental context, urbanization is even recommended for the development of economy and sometimes human rights. So this urbanization promotes uprootedness, as many sociologists are saying, which reduce the central position of locality as a central ground of stable community. So this social economy organization based on locality, I doubt whether this kind of idea has as strong relevance as before. So I think Polanyi's idea of cross-cutting membership could work for development of the current social economy organization in their relationship with the locality. So the cooperation between SCOs and local communities could mean more cross-cutting membership and mutual recognition. And the aforementioned forums could have been hosted more in combination between different groups of social economy and also the local authority instead of well, actually, I lost the context, but anyway, so this cross-cutting membership and mutual recognition rather than some kind of formal institutional unification or combination. And but still, it will be good for the social economy organizations to find a way of making this kind of mutual recognition and cross-cutting membership with local community, even if there is uprootedness and and urbanization, because still the current voting system is based on locality. So if social economy organization is detached from local community, then its political strength can be reduced. Political voice can be reduced. Thank you very much. So I have 2 more minutes, which I guess is enough. Polanyi's idea of functionally organized society and the guild socialism can be an alternative to the relationship between the social SCOs and locality. But the challenges, my ideas are not very distilled about the last point, so I skipped that point. And I guess I can complete my presentation here. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And I am in great admiration that you are even vertical at this hour of your of your time.
Thank you. Well, I already prepared my pajama behind me. So,
good. I hope you can hop into bed when you're done. So thank you so much. And our final speaker is Paula Valderrama, who will be speaking on state power in Polanyi's work, Emancipation or Serfdom.
Okay, so glad to see you all, at least virtually. I hope you can hear me. Yes, what I'm trying to do, moment. So I go directly to the paper. The goals of my paper are to present Polanyi's main arguments concerning the role of the state. Of course, there is no systematic, Polanyi does not offer us a systematic state theory. That's why we can only use reconstructions of Polanyi's insights. For this reconstruction, I've used mainly his theoretical research. Particularly, I'm focusing on the philosophical investigations. This kind of investigations concern the concept of the state as such, and he uses for that also theoretical constructions, such as the liberal state, the fascist state, and the communist state. Of course, all of these categories, state categories, are based on empirical situations and events. This is, of course, the starting point of the theory, but as such, it's not an empirical based analysis. It is a theoretical analysis. It's working with beliefs, with system of beliefs, with assumptions. And yes, Polanyi is a multi-level thinker. So I think it's important to understand that in some of the texts, he uses different levels in which he's arguing. And so sometimes he's talking about, I don't know, the New Deal or Great Britain or something, very observed policies which are taking place. And he talks as a political analyst, but he is also able at the same time to talk and to analyze as a philosopher. And I am saying this because there is this discussion whether Polanyi, for example, guilt socialism or is an ideal model, and or Polanyi is in the early years, whether he is idealist and afterwards he becomes realist. So I don't think so. I think Polanyi is always realist, but he is able to argue different levels, and some of the levels is a philosophical level. And so he is dealing with theoretical ideals, with ideas, and theoretical constructions and norms. So in some of the empirical base, when he's, for example, what concerns the New Deal and the war, and I think he has another view, he arguments differently. But in this essay, I'm concentrated only in his, like I said, in his philosophical investigations. I'm defending the thesis that the political state is, of course, an important instrument of emancipation. The political democratic state, he can be an instrument of emancipation, but it is also always, and at the same time, an institution of power. And the pandemic has made this art of inherent contradiction evident. The state pursues goals such as health or saving lives, but the measures imply definitely a loss of freedom. And so I don't think that the COVID state is like an exception state. This contradiction between power and emancipation is always in each modern state. That's, I will argue. And that's why Polanyi's idea of democratic socialism he wants to achieve a reduction of market power, but also of state coercion. That's why models like Lim said of socialism and of a lot of citizen participation are really important for Polanyi. And I don't think that it's only important in the early years, because the problem of freedom is always for Polanyi important. So I will start with the political state. When Polanyi uses the term political state, he is focusing on the role of the state out of a normative perspective. So he is dealing with the state, of course, not as it is, but as it ought to be. He is asking himself, what are the goals of a political democratical state? Which are our expectations? So the state is the political institution per se, the main instrument of the political. Political, the term, is used by Polanyi in a very classic and broader conception. He is not meaning antagonistic politics, or he's not meaning currently daily politics. He is meaning, as he says, for example, the way of life of the members of the polis, of course, with a lot of difference. But what is behind this idea of the political is the dimension of society in which the individuals have the possibility to consciously transform society. So this is an associative view of politics, is based on the precondition of the commonality of human beings. That is, that human beings have common goals, and that they are able to set common values. That's why Polanyi talks about, also he uses the term believing politics, which I've translated also to moral politics. Moral politics or believing politics is the interdependence between the political institutions and the moral beliefs, attitudes, and moral actions of the individual. This interdependence, is twofold. The political institutions and the state, these institutions influence the individual, but also the kinds of beliefs which individuals have influence also the constitution of these institutions. So it's a circle. When he talks about the political state, then the political state has the purpose or the goal of creating a human society. A human society is, we need to take the human being as unity. So Polanyi says morality is not a private affair. It's also a political affair. And the goal of the political state is not only economic and social development, but also moral progress. And the consequence of that is that bad institutions mean moral decay. So this is a conviction which Polanyi also has. The values, the moral political values pursued by the political state are social justice, equality, treatment with equality, or more, the equality is treating human beings as equals, social freedom, and the provision of human rights. So, but as I said before, the state action involves always state power. And Polanyi is concerned not about the fact that state power exists, because it will always exist, and we need also the state, and he knows that. He is concerned about the form in which this kind of state power is exercised. And he asks, is there any better way to, for example, to achieve social justice or healthcare? It's a question concerning the policies, which policies are set, and which kind of decision-making process has been used. And the question behind is, are these decision-making processes democratic enough? So, as I said, we will always have state power, but Polanyi tries to reduce this power. His theory of state power is based on Marx's reification theory. I will not go inside because it's too long and you can read it in the paper. But Marx's reification theory is mainly it's a critique of capitalism, and it's a critique of its objective entities such as capital, interest, market prices, economic laws. And because these entities diminish our individual responsibility towards social realities. When we see words or terms like global poverty, unemployment, ecological disaster, it's like it is difficult as an individual to take this responsibility. And because we have less responsibility, we have also less freedom. That's the thesis of Polanyi. And interesting in this analysis of the reification theory, when he's criticizing the capitalist entities, at the end he says this whole analysis is not as true not only of the economy but also of the state. And here we have then a problem, because state regulations, of course, are necessary, but we still need to have in our heads the problem that it means also loss of freedom. So the second part of maybe the philosophical analysis is the use of state categories. These are theoretical constructions. I'm going to, I don't know how much time do I have. The liberal state is what the most people know. Interesting is because the liberal state, Polanyi says, is a consequence of economic liberalism and the cause of the market society. Again, we have the relation between being and consciousness, between ideas and reality. The liberal state is a consequence of economic liberalism. That is a theory, the theory of economic liberalism was a belief, the belief on spontaneous progress, and politics has taken this belief and make it in policies. And that's why the liberal state is the state which is influenced by economic liberalism as idea, and is also the cause of the market society. He doesn't want a market society, he wants a market economy, but as an unintentional consequence, he forms the market society. Also important is, of course, that the market society and the market economy are not spontaneous, but a project of the liberal state. And the state interventions are inherent to any form of liberal and afterwards of neoliberal state. The fascist state, don't say so much because Kristopher did it already. But the fascist state is also, the analysis is really very interesting. Fascism is a result of the deadlock, he says, caused by economic liberalism, of the chaos, of the incompatibility between the democratic social claims and the requirements of the market economy. Fascism is a kind of solution. That is, they try to unify society in the economic sphere by annihilating democracy. So democracy is the fascist state or the corporate state is a state which takes the industry and puts it instead of the political state. So the goals of humanness, of social justice are not important anymore. Democracy doesn't exist. And like Polanyi says, the political state is abolished in fascism. no body exists anymore to voice the idea of humanist justice and freedom. The other two categories, the communist state and the socialist state in a functional democracy. The communist state, or let's say socialism and communism, are the opposite kind of solution, but to the same problem, the deadlock, what we have. The deadlock, the incompatibility between democracy and economics. And socialism and communism are exactly the opposite attempt. They want to unite the society, to unify society, but it's in its political sphere. And there are not so much texts where Polanyi criticizes the communist state, but there are a couple of texts where he says, he distinguishes between communism and democratic socialism. Communism, in many of the texts, means state socialism or a central plan economy. And he says to this, it intends to abolish the economic sphere, to make politics absolute and merge the economy in the state. And we have a lot of texts in the 20s, in the early 20s and 30s, where he says when a state tries to organize the whole economy, the result is that the state is totalitarian too. Of course, the communist state has not the goals of fascism. It's completely different. But here it's clear that not only the goals of the state are important, but also the means. And in Socialist Accountancy, where he is discussing with Ludwig von Mises, he is very clear that the state socialism or a central planned economy is not really socialism, he says, because it's totalitarian and you don't have overview about the needs, about the preferences, about what the citizen, what the citizen wants. This is important for Polanyi. So he says socialism can be only done in a functional, organized society, as Lim said and explained quite more as what I will explain now. I would just say democratic socialism is the attempt to democratize the economy by increasing workers or citizen participation. In the idea model, there is territorial and also functional representation. And the regulations are determined by negotiation between state institutions or state representatives and functional representatives. So there is a main discussion whether this model is too idealist. And I must say one thing, it's not so important whether Polanyi, or in the 1950s, he already wanted to have the same model. The important thing is if this kind of model helps us today to develop criteria with which we can evaluate state action. And I do think this is very important also for the COVID state, because the COVID state we can not only evaluate according to the goals, but also to the according to the means with which were the policies used, but also which were the decision-making processes. That is a vital question in order to evaluate the COVID state. And also, of course, which are the real consequences of the politics. The goals of saving lives and healthcare, we can say are fundamental rights. So it's not the problem that this goes, the problem of the goals, but it's a problem of the one-sidedness, because we can save lives and healthcare, but what about the other goals? The political state, he has to represent mankind. He has to take human beings as humans and not only in its biological function. So my critique of the COVID state is that saving lives and healthcare is, of course, important, but we also need to know other goals. What happened with the inequalities? We have an enormous increase of social inequalities. Even here in Germany, the children who cannot go, who are doing now homeschooling. So for some, it's not a problem, but for many, it's 1 year of nothing. So the inequality would be worse. I mean, really worse. So we have other problems like increasing public debt without a tax reform, nationalism, no international cooperation, no international solidarity, and save it an economy, but more or less only big business. So, but what I mostly criticize for the current state is the decision-making process. I'm asking the question if it was democratic enough. At least in Germany, not the elected parliaments is now 1 year afterwards asked opinion, but if not, it was only everything decided by the federal government. And my main question is: this is an extraordinary situation. We need extraordinary measures, that then it is necessary to have extraordinary. Time's up. Extraordinary legitimation. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Paula.
Sorry, I've just read it.
That's all right. No problem. No problem. Well, thank you to all four of you, and for all of you for sticking to the time. So we have a couple of questions so far. Let me start with one from an anonymous attendee, very sexy, anonymous. This is specifically for Chris. And Chris, the question is, if fascism is essentially about obliterating the individual, what would you say about the hyper-focus on individual identity in contemporary society and politics? Does this link to the idea of fascism as individual consciousness disconnected from, does this link to the idea of fascism as individual consciousness that is disconnected from the workings of society?
Thank you for the question. One of the interesting things about a Zoom meeting is that you actually get to see a question pop up before it's asked to you. So I'm not normally just completely stumped like I would be. So it's a really deep question, and I'm very out of my depth answering it, but it's very thought provoking. And so the idea of there being, what does fascist anti-individualism have to say about a hyper focus on individual identity in contemporary society? I remember when I was doing research for my paper, there was a book on Ludwig Klages, who Polanyi draws the vitalist philosophy idea from in the essence of fascism. And the book was talking about how as the subject, as the dissolution of the subject occurs, this is precisely the point in which claims to freedom and individuality increase. And so I never really had a chance to think about that more, and I think it's covered in other works, but it's the immediate thing that came to mind as speaking directly to the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question, does this link to the idea of fascism as individual consciousness disconnected from the workings of society? Perhaps. I mean, it kind of gets to what Paula said about this loss of the freedom of individual responsibility for social realities. Do we focus more on individual identity in proportion to in which our control diminishes over the state of affairs surrounding us, or going more to my paper, the ability to create meaningful community or to account for the ethics of our actions in like a complex modern technological society? Do we focus more on the individual identity as we lose sight of these? It's possible. It's possible this is another trick that neoliberalism plays on us. And then it kind of gets to the point I would make that Polanyi would probably argue that if you want to defeat fascism, the best way of doing it would be to not necessarily to punch a Nazi or whatever, but would be to actually try to deepen the democratic structures in our society beyond formal representation. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kristopher. The next question is to Paula. And the question is it correct that to affirm that Polanyi proposes a different view of communism, given that most communist theories and proposals, as far as I'm aware of, propose the dissolution or the abolition of the state?
Yes, I wrote already the answer. Polanyi has, of course, he knows this too many meanings of communism. When he is criticizing communism as totalitarian, he is using the meaning of communism as state socialism or a central plan economy. Of course, he knows the other view of a free association of producers, the Marx ideal, and without any state. But he thinks this could be a regulative ideal, but it's an utopic ideal. In this sense, is Polanyi a realist? And he says a modern state is necessary. We cannot have a state, a nation without a state. So this utopic communism without state is not the alternative of Polanyi. The state is necessary. He is there to make laws, but we need also to democratize the state as much as possible. To use, for example, like Limsack, functional organizations, grassroots organizations, this citizen participation, this the state who decides about everything, even when it is democratically elected, I think is not enough. It's okay?
Yes, thank you very much. And I saw that you had actually written that out. That was fantastic. Yeah. We don't have any more questions right now written in the Q&A. I'll jump in just to fill some time and ask, throw a couple things out. One is, Paula, as I'm sure you may have run into in your research, that when Polanyi, when The Great Transformation was first published and received deafening silence, especially in the US, the New York Times, however, did review it and gave it, it was reviewed by one of the leading Cold Warriors. I think it actually was reviewed in '44 and gave it an absolutely scathing review, just attacked it viciously. And the headline was "The Heavy Hand of Hegel." I don't know if you came across that review. No. Yeah, it's definitely worth looking at. And basically the argument was that he was the closet Stalinist, and that the critique of fascism was just Stalinism, and that it was a completely idealized notion of the Hegelian state, that history was moving towards, the Geist of history was moving towards the ideal state. And it's a shocking review, but absolutely perfect for its time. Another comment that sort of brings together a couple of the papers. There's a very famous paragraph at the end of The Great Transformation that I'm sure you're all familiar with, where he talks about how during the Depression, in the face of mass unemployment and just devastating suffering, going on everywhere, that because the role of the state in the market was so suppressed and made invisible, that it allowed the individual to take on a supercilious smugness, to be absolutely morally, to call themselves morally exempt from any kind of responsibility. He says, I'm in nobody's debt. I paid my own way. I could probably find it in my copy here. And it's this absolute smugness that he ascribes, that he then links implicitly, not explicitly, back to his guild socialism, because he says what happens is that the link between the consumer and between the producer and the consumer is completely hidden, that everything that the producer does ends and then the consumer begins. And it brings together many of his ideas about the way that that suffering is facilitated by the disconnection that the hidden state makes possible, because it obliterates the idea of networks. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. No? Okay. New question. This is from Margie Mendel, and this is to Lim. Does the social economy require mobilization of citizens? Is this the reality in South Korea?
Yes, I was writing the answer. Well, not answer, my opinion. I think it could be yes and no, because political mobilization could have a kind of negative meaning in this country, because Koreans also had some kind of dictatorship past. So mobilization sounds like the developmental state mobilized citizens to participate in the kind of solemn war for economic development or something like that. But on the one hand, of course, there is no such compulsory mobilization in Korea anymore. But on the other hand, I think, yes, as CEOs, I feel like they are very much into promoting citizens' participation. They are always feeling like they have insufficient grassroots level organization. They are not very much embedded in community. So we need more participation or something like that. So if that is the meaning of mobilization, yes, I think social economy people are very much interested in. So there are, in a sense, there are some kind of debates. So on the one hand, according to my discussion with social economy activists, so some people are not very much interested in citizens' mobilization. To be honest, they are more interested in workplace democracy in their own workplace. So guild. But more kind of anarchistic guild. So they don't care whether citizens participate in their social economy and whether this changes the economic culture in Korea or something like that. Their workplace democracy itself is the utmost value. But there are also other social economic groups who wanna have more kind of grassroots support for them, so they can change the culture into be more, let's say, socialistic or something. So yes, I think there are some different trends among them. Yeah. If that is answer.
Okay, let's see. We don't have any more written questions.
Can I say something?
Paula, go ahead.
Yes, just something short, because you were talking about this consumers and producers, and I just wanted to say, for Polanyi was also, there was a condition. I mean, he knew this wouldn't work, at least at the beginning, because he says we are missing a specific kind of education. This education is not academic preparation, nothing at all. It is a form of consciousness. And this consciousness is that we need to learn that this society exists only because these different functions work together. And that's why I think Ling said, that's why we need first to understand that we are always consumers and producers, or employees and employers, and we are citizens and also government. Yeah, to say we are always subjects and sovereign. And of course, Polanyi knew this consciousness is not available at that time, and also not now. And this was for Polanyi like a kind of precondition. So I think we also need to talk, like I said, about education. And I don't mean academic, but really this kind of consciousness that we are one society and all the functions. When I see the negotiations now in a pandemic, of course, it is difficult to reach really agreements, because everybody is still fighting for a group, yeah, without understanding. We need to understand also the other ones. I mean, we are also teachers and students, and we need to understand every part. This is maybe an idea, but that was exactly the problem of this idea. Polanyi knew this, wanted to say this.
Yeah, I think Polanyi would be very ambivalent about the COVID state. I think that on the one hand, for Polanyi, the mask would be the very embodiment of his ethic of solidarity, of his notion that people take actions thinking that that they're just individual actions without any awareness, without any ethical concept that their actions have repercussions hundreds of people down the line, and that's why we have to act on the assumption that our actions have that enormous butterfly effect. On the other hand, so that's why I think of the mask, should say Karl Polanyi on it. At the same time, I think that he would also agree with you about the lack of democratic transparency, at least, let's put it that way, or the fiction of the democratic state, who's in the sense of where these decisions are coming from. But when it comes to where he would see himself between public health and epidemiology on the one side versus the Michigan militia who want to kidnap and execute our governor on the other, I think where he stands would be pretty clear. So, okay, well, there's no harm in ending 1 minute earlier so that people can grab something to eat before the next session, which is at 2:15, as I believe. So thank you so much to all of you. These were 4 fantastically interesting papers, and I really look forward to seeing them in print in various forms. And I want to thank all of you for the hard work that you did in making these presentations. So
thank you.
That is it.
Thank you very much.
I look for that New York Times article.
Bye.
Bye-bye.